كلام الله داوي نفوسنا نحس في أعماقنا الإيمان كالحجارة قسوة فإن القرآن حين
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا إنك أنت الجواد الكريم Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to our series Reflections on the Qur'an. We were talking in earlier episodes about the importance of Qur'an to Islamic civilization, the efforts that Muslims have made to preserve it and to preserve the means by which to understand it. Now, as is pretty obvious to anybody who's studied any history, the public role of Islam has been in a state of decline over the last few centuries. A part of that is due to external causes, and a part of it is due to internal causes. With regard to the relationship between the two, it's a well-known fact that if there's an epidemic, there are certain individuals that will succumb to that outside infection, and others who have resistance that will not succumb. So the health of individual that is confronted with this outside disease has a lot to do with how the disease will affect them, or that outside challenge. In ecology, I remember reading about there's some kind of beetle that attacks a certain kind of tree, and when the trees are vigorous and the sap that flows within the tree equivalent of a vein, I don't know what you call it. So when the sap, in some trees, the sap is plentiful, and when the beetle tries to dig into that kind of a tree, the sap repels it. So it doesn't see that tree as being a fitting tree to bore into, to tunnel into. It'll go look for another tree. So another tree where the sap is not flowing as strongly, the beetle will find that more suitable to bore into. So yes, there were external factors that led to the conquest of Muslim lands, but there were also internal factors. So part of the process of trying to figure out what's gone wrong, one of the early steps in that process was Muslims who looked at the received understanding of the Qur'an and compared it by themselves going to the Qur'an and saying, wait a minute, not everything that scholars have been telling us is a clear indication of the texts. So you have this process of revisionist Tafseer of the Qur'an, which has continued down from those earliest modernist Tafseers of the 19th century. And at this point, you have this school of new reading of the Qur'an and new reading of the Sunnah. But a lot of the focus is new reading on the Qur'an itself. So how valid are these new readings? To what extent should our understanding of the Qur'an be based upon ancient explanations of it? These are critical issues that confront the Muslims, because there are two aspects to the learning of the meanings of the Qur'an. If we bypass the understanding of the early generations entirely, then we have divorced ourselves from the understanding of those who were closest to the process of revelation, particularly the Sahaba, but also the generation or two that followed them. So if we disregard that entirely, then the Qur'an becomes much more of a plaything in the hands of people who are not following the proper rules, the methodology for understanding it. So one of the issues with tafsir, or with interpreting any text, is that anybody, when reading any text, brings to it a background, the experiences that they had in life, the kind of education they received. These things impact their outlook on the world. So it is, some level, it's unavoidable to bring that to the text. And however, when that text is the Qur'an, then just imposing your view upon the Qur'an is invalid. So every generation has to also look for the relevance of the Qur'an to the world in which they're living. A person who was living in Istanbul at the height of the Ottoman Empire, their understanding of the world would be very different from a Muslim who is born in Myanmar in the 21st century and living as an oppressed minority in a land that is hostile to the Muslims. So the experience that the people in Myanmar bring to the Qur'an and the world view would be very different than somebody who was living at a time when Islam was powerful and that it ruled the affairs of public life in countries where the Muslims were dominant. You have situations nowadays in majority Muslim countries where you have this battle between secularist governments and Islamist oppositions. You have differing interpretations of Islam between various schools of thought. So everybody comes to the Qur'an with some factors that would influence the way that they would look at it, but there has to be some kind of an objective methodology by which these views can be measured. So it is not to say that finding new meanings in the Qur'an is prohibited, because the Qur'an is an endless source of divine guidance, and it has maintained its relevance to human life down through the centuries, and it's still relevant today, and it will still be relevant tomorrow. And one of the tasks of the scholars of Tafseer in every generation is to point out to people how the Qur'an is relevant to their lives that they're living now. And that's part of the reason that Tafseers continue to be composed over the passage of centuries. There's always somebody in every generation who undertakes a tafsir of the Qur'an. And in many cases, there are many people in a given generation who did that. If the tafsir of the Qur'an was something, it was locked in a certain period of time, then these subsequent tafsirs after that, what would be the need for them, and would they even be valid? That issue would have arisen, and to the best of my understanding, there hasn't been that kind of a rejection that, hey, you know, all the tafsir that needs to be written has already been written. You have no right to write a tafsir in this time. I'm not aware that scholars ever said that. Scholars would point out that, hey, so-and-so, he wrote this tafsir, and here he said something, and that contradicts this principle of the religion, or it contradicts this thing, which is also part of the Qur'an, or it contradicts what is a well-known aspect of the Sunnah. Criticisms have been and will continue to be directed at interpretations of the Qur'an based on that conflict between a particular interpretation and something which would override it or indicate that that interpretation is flawed. So now let's start looking at the process or the methodology that has been agreed upon pretty much by scholars down through the ages, that there's these steps involved in understanding the Qur'an. Now the first step that sometimes you see in the list is you understand the Qur'an by the Qur'an. But that really presupposes that you already understand the wordings. We're going to take a break here. We'll come back and pick this up, inshallah.
This Ramadan,
Welcome, O Ramadan.
Ramadan, the month of blessings. Suhr, Iftar, Taraweeh, Laylatul Qadr, Aitikaf, Eidul Fitr, and many other practices that Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did in this month of fasting. I'll be there for you throughout this glorious month of Ramadan. Let's make it more fruitful and reward-worthy. Share a date with me every day throughout this month of Ramadan.
Watch 1 hour exclusive episodes. Ramadan, a date with Dr. Zakir. Every day at 8 p.m. UK and 9 p.m. Europe on Peace TV. Explore the options. Match the qualities. Assure the success.
What happens at school, or more specifically, what happens inside the classroom. Good qualities of classrooms: interactive, challenging, collaborative, distributive focus, student-centered. Let's together examine the quality of education that is provided to our children. To judge this quality precisely, join me on Peace TV.
Join Dr. Mamdou Muhammad in Teaching at School every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday at 5 p.m. UK and 6 p.m. Europe on Peace TV.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Is it permissible for a Muslim to isolate himself from people? This is a question that people in the past, some of them would isolate themselves. Some of them would say, no, we need to be mixed with the people. There's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, authentic hadith, that says, المؤمن الذي يخالط الناس ويصبر على أذاهم خير من المؤمن الذي لا يخالط الناس ولا يصبر على أذاهم, which means the believer that mixes with the people and is patient when it comes to the harm that comes from the people is better and more beloved to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala than the believer that isolates himself and does not have patience from the harm of the people. So in general, yes, it's better for the Muslim to mix with the people, but with the condition, as it's mentioned in the hadith, to be patient when it comes to the harm from the people. One thing that should never be compromised is the deen of Allah. The deen of Islam, our religion, is our flesh and blood. It's something that we should never compromise. So if someone claims that people are the reason for him to commit sins, then the answer to this is isolate yourself from these people, or isolate yourself from the fitan. At times of fitan, trying times of tribulations, the best for the believers is to isolate themselves. Something very interesting for us to know that the Prophet ﷺ, when he said in the hadith, يوشك أن يكون خير مال المسلم, that very soon, one of the signs of the hour, that the best wealth of the Muslim, غنم, goats and sheep, يتبع بها شعف الجبال, that he would follow the mountains, ومواقع الخطر, and the places where the rain comes down. For what reason? Why would a Muslim leave his town and his people and just get some goat and sheep and go out in the desert, going after the drops of rain and so on? يَفِرُّ بِدِينِهِ مِنَ الْفِتَنِ. He flees with his religion from fitan, from tribulations. The significance of this hadith is that to protect one's religion, this is something that is never to be compromised. Everything else can be compromised. Our wealth, our life, our families, the most important thing is our religion, and to be steadfast on the deen of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Therefore, we need to be upon this matter that when people say, for example, my friends, we know that the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, that al-mar'u ala dini khalili, that the person is upon the religion of his intimate friend. When people would take it as an excuse to commit sins because they're friends, well, don't have friends. Stay away from friends. Person would say, how can I live my life without any friends? We're not saying to isolate yourself and not to have any friends, but if you claim that you don't have any friends except sinful friends, and definitely they would lead you to sin and so on, then the answer to this is, don't have them as your friends. Even if you would isolate yourself, even if you don't have any friends, seek help from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to hold fast on your religion. This is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants from us. That's why when the ulama, they put the Bukhari and others, باب التعرب في الفتنة, or as some put the dots of it, التغرب or التعزب, and all the same thing is correct according to the different narrations, which means whether to go to the Badiyah, to the desert and so on, to the Bedouin life, or whether to be a stranger at times of fitan. It's valid to happen, and that's why Muslims should be upon this to protect one's religion. The most important thing is to protect the religion, not to compromise the orders of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back. We're talking about the importance of the Qur'an and the importance of understanding it and the importance of a proper methodology for interpreting its meanings. Let me step back a minute. I was planning to and then forgot to talk about this analogy. Previously we were talking about the recession or the shrinking of Islam from the public life of the Muslims, the public domain. And there's a piece of writing that it really impressed me by the German-born economist E.F. Shoemaker. He wrote a seminal book of the early 70s called Small is Beautiful, where he challenged some of the economic precepts that were dominant in how development takes place, particularly in the third world. And he was comparing the contrast between Germany after World War II and how quickly it was rebuilt, as opposed to trying to bring a country like Zambia or whatever, third world country, trying to bring it up to a level of development. Now, there are all kinds of factors for why that is. One of the factors that he mentioned, which is relevant to our topic here, he said that by the end of World War II, Germany, many of the cities looked like the surface of the moon. They had just been thoroughly destroyed. But there were people left who remembered how that system worked. So every individual had a picture of the way a developed society functions. And there was the human capital present in that society where particular skills that are needed to run a modern society were present. Obviously, not every person has all those skills, so they have to be distributed amongst the members of the society. But the thing that they all had in common, more or less, was an understanding or a mental picture of the way a modern economy, modern society functions. In a place like Zambia, I don't want to pick on Zambia, but let's say the Congo, which is even more, I mean, Zambia is at least a functioning country. Congo has been kind of like a basket case for years. So at the time that the colonial power in the Congo left the Congo, in contrast to some other colonial powers like England, which at least educated some portion of the local population in order to become public servants and to be able to carry on functions of administration in the country. At the time that Belgium left the Congo, there was, if I recall correctly, there was one person in the country who had a bachelor's degree, and he became the president of the country. I can't remember what his exact qualification was. It might have been postgraduate. But the number of graduates, even from high school, was almost non-existent. So to bring a country like that into the modern era, the people, the human capital required to do that just wasn't there. So the country has been struggling ever since independence. How is any of that relevant to the Qur'an and to the role of Islam in modern Islamic, modern Muslim countries? In order for Islam to be returned to people's lives, individually and collectively, people have to understand what the message is. So that idea of having a mental picture of the way the thing is supposed to work, the way a functioning Islamic society should work. If that's present in the minds of the individuals who make up the society, then achieving it in the real world becomes possible. Of course, there will be challenges, so many challenges, and part of the challenge there is that there will be different interpretations based upon the core text of what it means to apply Islam in the times in which we're living. But if people don't have a picture of how it's supposed to work based upon those core texts, then the task will not be difficult, it will be impossible. So let's get back now to some of the process required in returning to the Qur'an and searching in it for meanings, discovering the meanings of the Qur'an. So because the Qur'an is in a particular language, then understanding that language becomes critical to having direct access to the message. Now, if you're a non-Arabic speaking Muslim, which is actually the majority of the Muslims in the world are non-Arabic speaking, then that impairs your ability to understand the Qur'an directly. So you are now dependent on a translator's understanding of the Qur'an. And one of the features of Arabic or any language is that sometimes a word will have shades of meaning, and when you're translating, you have to pinpoint one of those particular meanings in order to express it in that other language. So you have to narrow down the range of meanings, choose one of them. So that's one thing. So a certain amount of meaning is always lost in the translation process of any text from one language to another. Another feature is that sometimes translators, they take a shortcut to explaining what a word means. Instead of using 4 or 5 words, use something that's close to it, which has a linguistic relationship to the word in the Arabic. So, for instance, one of the missionary attacks upon the Qur'an was the fact that it uses, where Qur'an is threatening the magicians, لَأُصَلِّبَنَّكُمْ. He says, I will crucify you. If you check almost any English translation of the Qur'an, it says crucify. So the kind of execution that was used in Palestine by the Romans, that they say that Jesus was crucified, was that there was this cross that was a vertical member and then a horizontal member, and that, you know, anyone who was sentenced to death was nailed to it. And that the criticism of the Qur'an was, wait a minute, you know, this way of executing people that the Romans use, which is called crucifixion, this wasn't practiced before the Romans. So therefore the Qur'an made a historical error. You know, somebody who didn't understand history wrote that text. And I referred earlier to the website Islamic Awareness and how they refuted another missionary attack upon the Qur'an from a similar kind of angle, that the use of the word dirham in the sale of Yusuf was anachronistic, a historical error. They also responded to this criticism, and they went into this deep, deep analysis of what the word sallaba or yaslibu, what it means in the Arabic language. So originally what it meant was impaling. You know, there was a stake and the person was placed on the sharp point of the stake and it went through the person. So one of the things that happens in that process is that the person starts bleeding because they've been impaled. And eventually you get this fluid that's called salib. And I forget the exact word, it may be another variant of the root word. Eventually that clear fluid has that same word, comes from the same root. And so people who were subjected to that form of torture, that was a characteristic. And so the verb does not necessarily mean being put up on that thing that the Romans used. Human impalement was used long, long before the Romans. So here you have an example of where the Christian missionary was reading English translations of the Qur'an, and they probably checked quite a few of them, and they all said crucified. And so they said, well, you know, they all saying the same thing, that must be an accurate translation. And so that was an example of where the translator just uses a shortcut for the sake of using one word instead of 3 or 4, and there's subtle distortion of the meaning. Sometimes it's pretty clear that there's really an error in translation. In Surah Al-Anbiya, where it describes Yunus when he left his city, وَظَنُّونِ إِذْ ذَهَبَ مُغَاضِبًا فَظَنَّ أَن لَّن نَّقْدِرَ عَلَيْهِ. The way that that's translated is to this effect, that talking about Yunus, that when he left, he went away angry, talking about his departure from Nineveh after his people rejected his message. And some of the translation says, and he thought that we would not have power over him. That's a mistranslation, because one of the meanings of the word naqdir is to tighten or straighten things. So he thought that he wasn't going to suffer negative consequences from leaving the city. Not that he didn't think Allah had power over him. How could a prophet think that? So this is an example of a mistranslation. We've run out of time for this episode. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
اقرأ أخيا